another Garner Smarter. This is a partnership with the Calvert Library with the Calvert Master Garners. We have only 3 more Garner Smarters. One on June 26th, which will be talking about secret lives of garden insects. And then we have one in September for basic beekeeping. And then our last one is in October, the 16th on integral gardening, go with the flow gardening. We are the Master Gardeners as well as the Calvert Library are collecting suggestions and ideas for 2022's Garden Smarters. So you can send me an email and I will forward it to the extension as well as the Master Gardeners. You can place your questions either on chat or the Q&A, and I will ask both Karen and Melanie those questions either after or during the presentation. Whenever you're ready, Karen and Melanie, you can get started. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody for joining us this morning. I'm going to put my video on just for while we're introducing ourselves, and then we'll be turning off our video just so it's not so distracting. But my name's Karen Anderson. I've been a Master Gardener with Calvert County since 2006. It's hard to believe all that time. I'm also a Master Naturalist, and I'll let Melanie introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Melanie Crowder, and I am a Master Gardener as well, and I am also the Baywise Coordinator for Calvert County.
So we're going to start off with just a few introductory slides about the program. Melanie's going to talk about the grasses, and then I will talk about the sedges, and then we'll follow up with some resources for you all. So we'll get started. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Master Gardener program, it is associated with the University of Maryland and in the Extension Service. So that's part of the program. This is just a view of all the different pieces of a Master Garden program. So the different emphasis, so plant clinics, Baywise, as Melanie mentioned, we do a lot of Baywise visits here in Calvert County. Emphasis on pollinators and native plants. So this one really kind of falls under our native plant emphasis. And then if you're not already familiar with some of the resources that the university has, the Home and Garden Information Center is really great. They have quite a bit of information posted online. They also have a place where you can actually submit questions and photos about your garden to ask the experts, and they typically reply back within, a day or two with information as much as they can help you on certain things. So I'll let Melanie get started with her grasses.
Okay, so I actually volunteered for this presentation because I wanted to learn more about grasses, and I felt like I was not utilizing them as much as I'd like to in my yard. I'm going to talk about grasses, and then when I'm finished, Karen is going to talk about sedges, and it will be great if you could hold your questions until I finish with the sunny grasses, and then we'll pause and take some questions. And you can always put things in the chat as well, of course. So why grow grasses? Well, grasses are amazingly versatile. They have, they're a great backdrop for other plants and bulbs. The seed heads and stems move in the wind and the light and are very appealing to look at. They have winter interest and fall color and interest. They create structure in the garden and repetition. You can actually use them in containers. Not sure how many of us have thought of that, or as specimens, or they can be a backdrop to other plants. They can be hedges, clumps, or you could even create a meadow. Grasses provide a lot of seed for birds, and they're a host plant for a number of butterflies. And they also provide a lot of shelter for birds and insects, and they're a good nesting material. In general, deer don't eat the grasses. That's good news. And their grasses are adapted to a wide variety of soils, very adaptable. They can be used in what we call health strips, or those little dry places along the roadway, xeriscaping, rain gardens, and erosion control. Very important for erosion control. And as we go along, I'll be discussing where these grasses are found in nature. And it's best when we plant them in our landscapes to try to replicate that for the best success. So this picture is actually the Delaware Botanic Gardens. Not sure how many of you have had the chance to go there. It's a relatively new garden. And this meadow was created by Piet Oudolf, and he is known worldwide as as a designer of landscapes. And actually this meadow, quite a few horticulturists from all over the world flew in to volunteer their time to plant this meadow with Piet Oudolf and be a part of it. This is the meadow in fall. It's very lovely.
So just to break up the PowerPoint here. So why would you want to grow sedges? Well, they make excellent ground covers. So if you have a shady area, even dry shade, and you can't grow regular lawn, you may want to consider putting in sedges. Just like grasses, they can provide shelter and food for wildlife. And then some are actually host plants for butterflies. You may not think about that, but there are a number of sedges that actually the caterpillars will use them as a food source. So that's another good reason to use sedges. We have different sedges, and later on I'll go through different kinds of sedges and show you this, but they have different textures. So it's a way to add texture to your garden. And even if you use different kinds of sedges, there's different sedges, textures among the different sedges. You could even use it as a lawn replacement for areas that don't get a lot of foot traffic. And I'll go through later on ones that are best to use that way. There also is one that can actually tolerate some foot traffic. And as Melanie mentioned with the grasses, the sedges are really deer resistant. They don't really like to eat sedges. It's not one of their favorite foods. I won't say they never eat them, because deer just don't ever read, the lists of deer resistant plants, but for the most part, they are deer resistant. So how do you tell a grass from a sedge? But it's really the shape of the stem. So they're both monocots, but they're in different families within the monocots. So grasses, generally Poaceae family, the sedges in the Cyperaceae family. And here's a little, over here on the right side is a little saying that you may have heard. Sedges have edges, rushes are round, and grasses have knees that bend to the ground. So that's kind of one way to easily tell apart a sedge from a grass. And you can see the illustration here down below. So you can see the sedge, you can see it's got that sort of triangular stem. If you were to try to roll it between your fingers, it doesn't really roll easily because it has those edges. With the grasses, they tend to have these swollen joints along the stems that are hollow. And if you were to roll those between your fingers, it would pretty much roll fairly easily because they have the rounded stem. So a quick way to tell them apart for the most part. There's always kind of exceptions.
Okay, so just a few more tidbits here on grasses before we get started digging into the sunny grasses. Carl Foster was a horticulturist, and he called grasses the hair of Mother Earth, which I think this picture almost illustrates a little bit. But he wasn't the first person to call grasses that, and it turns out that Native American people also call grasses the hair of Mother Earth and consider the grasses to be a gift from the Creator. Particularly, they refer to sweetgrass, also known as buffalo grass, and as one of the sacred plants. In 2020, the Maryland Native Plant Society actually named that year the Year of the Grasses. And if you want to learn even more about grasses, the recordings are on their website, and some of them are really quite excellent. And they're free. So they also, Maryland Native Plant Society called it the year of the graminoids. So graminoids in botany or ecology, that means a herbaceous plant with grass-like morphology. And as Karen mentioned, Poaceae, hope I'm saying that correctly, is actually the family of grasses. And interestingly, there are 12,000 species of grasses. Poaceae is the largest, fifth largest plant family. And in Maryland, there are actually, this slide says 395, there are actually over 350 grass species in Maryland, which is a lot for a small state. And grasses are actually pollinated with something called wind pollination. So the pollen is actually transferred from one plant to the other, carried by air currents. And this picture actually is Biscoe Gray Park in Prince Frederick, which is a Calvert County park. It's a relatively new park. And I actually want to bring your attention to that mowed pathway, which is a really nice way to create structure in a native plant garden or a meadow and have a more of an orderly appearance and walkability. So next we're going to dig into some grasses for sun. And this picture also is the Delaware Botanic Garden, by the way, which you probably are recognizing by now. And so the grass is listed. I'm going to go through one by one. In general, the grasses that like sun are warm season grasses. That means they have more active growth in the late spring, and they're generally dormant in the early winter to late fall. And in general, they don't tolerate shade very well at all. Okay, we can move on. So now we're going to look at big blue stem. And I do have all the botanical names for each plant listed on every slide, so you'll be able to refer to that. So this is a really tall grass, provides a great striking background. It's nice for a border or a screen. It doesn't tolerate shade. This plant, big blue stem, can be a nice alternative for the invasive miscanthus or fountain grass. So if you have some of that and you want to get rid of it, you might want to consider this as a replacement. There are quite a few cultivars for big blue stem. One in particular called Red October is very stunning, beautiful color. This grass was once widespread across the prairies in the North American prairies, and the root system can extend for 12 feet into the ground. So it really has an extraordinary capacity to withstand drought and extreme temperatures. We can go on to the next slide. So little blue stem is a lot smaller. It is a good plant for erosion control. It tolerates harsh soils. If not planted in the full sun, it will be okay, but it may be floppy. However, actually in meadows in nature, it flops over during rain or snow, and this provides a great habitat for birds and protection for wildlife. This grass really doesn't tolerate wet soil very much. It likes well-drained soil. It grows in clumps. One thing about this grass to keep in mind is it is a self-seeder. It casts the seeds out, and those seeds may drift quite far away. So that's good for the birds. They love to eat them, but it may cast into places in your yard. Maybe you don't want it, so you'll have to keep an eye out for that. Songbirds and game birds really love the seeds of this plant. Some cultivars for this one are a whole list of them: Indian steel, Sioux blue, and so on. And in general, the cultivars are made to stand up more and have different color variations. This is a great substitute, again, for miscanthus or maiden grass and fountain grass, which is penicillium. I can't say that one, but you know what I mean, hopefully. Okay. Penicillium, I think. So now we'll move on to switchgrass. I know I'm moving kind of quickly, but again, when we finish with the sunny grasses, we'll take an opportunity for your questions if you like. So switchgrass, I'll bet a lot of you have heard of switchgrass. This picture of the switchgrass is the green grass in the photo, and this is actually the Sunrise Garden in North Beach. I don't know if you've had a chance to go there. It's a great example of grasses and native plants in a rain garden, as well as other parts of the garden are nice too. Beside the switchgrass in the picture is Carl Foster, which I mentioned before, which is not a native plant, but it's also not an invasive plant. So it's one that is okay, and it does have some nice function. It's very tall and stands up straight. And then there's Joe Pye weed in the front. So switchgrass is kind of versatile. It tolerates both wet and dry soil, but if it's too shady, again, it might flop. One thing to really keep in mind is it's salt tolerant. That's great. So if you're looking for a salt tolerant grass on living shorelines, along water gardens, this might be a good choice. Switchgrass also has a lot of seed value for birds. You'll find it mostly along the coastal plain, along shorelines, and in nature. Has a nice height. You can substitute it for the miscanthus, which is an invasive plant. Switchgrass is really one of the main species of grasses of the North American prairie. It ranges all the way from Canada to Mexico, from the Rockies going east. You will see it growing naturally along roadsides and even in brackish marshes. It does spread by rhizomes in all directions. So that means you're going to plant a clump and it's going to get bigger. It was researched as a biofuel. I thought that was interesting. I don't know what has come of that, but it's interesting to know. It is self-sowing as well. So it spreads by both rhizomes and by seeds. There are a bunch of cultivars of this grass. Northwind, Shenandoah, heavy metal, and so on. They tend to be dense and more in a column growing straight up. And so we can go on to the next slide. Purple lovegrass. This is a great grass that is probably a little bit underutilized. This grass you might see growing along roadsides. It could be used in xeriscaping. It also has some salinity tolerance, which is great. So could be used under those conditions. Really pretty seed heads that are purple, that are nice in floral arrangements, both dried or naturally. Does spread with rhizomes and also seeds. And it can be used in meadows. So I know I've heard some people say they want to start meadows. This would be a nice choice. It's fairly well behaved in the meadow, which is nice. It forms a nice, neat, tight clump. And of course, you'd want to have quite a few of them. It looks lovely that way. Looks nice in a mass planting. This grass can actually be mowed a few times a year. So if you wanted to use it as a lawn alternative with light foot traffic, it would be okay, but it won't tolerate heavy foot traffic. And it will go dormant in the winter, so you just need to know that. And now we're going to look at pink mealy grass. So pink mealy grass looks, again, lovely in masses. This is another picture of the Delaware Botanic Gardens. You can tell I was really taken by these gardens. These pictures were taken in the fall, actually in the rain, and the colors are just so dramatic, and the way they wave in the breeze. The flowers on the pink mealy grass are lovely. The foliage is interesting. This is a very interesting grass. You could actually collect the seeds in November with a comb. That's one way of propagating it. And it's a replacement for fountain grass. If you wanted to replace the invasive fountain grass, this is a nice choice. There's a lovely cultivar called white cloud. So instead of the pink cloud or the pink flowers, you would see the white, which is very, very dramatic. There's also a cultivar called bamboo muley, which could be a substitute for the invasive bamboo, if you like that appearance. And it's actually 5 to 6 feet tall. This group of grasses, Muhlenbergia, actually has 150 species. And it was named after a German botanist named Muhlenberg. And now we can go on to Indian grass, which I believe is the last of our sun-loving grasses. Indian grass is another one that I think is probably especially underutilized, and maybe some of us didn't know about it. It is very vertical, very tall, 5 to 7 feet, and it really could benefit from tall companion plants to keep it upright. It's wonderful on slopes for erosion control, tolerates drought. In general, it stays fairly low for most of the year, but then in autumn, before it blooms, it gets that very tall appearance. It really looks nice in clusters or drifts. This grass does reseed readily, but you could also propagate it through clumps or roots by dividing it. It's a nice alternative for pampas grass, Chinese silvergrass, and fountain grass. One thing to be aware of if you are creating a meadow is that it can outcompete other species. So it may not be the best choice for a meadow unless it's the only grass that you want there. It could be nice in that way. It is considered the state native grass of South Carolina. And some of the cultivars are Indian steel and Sioux blue. It really has nice motion, and the foliage when it is kind of dancing back and forth with the wind and the light behind it. Indian grass actually grows in well-drained floodplain prairies and low elevation riparian areas next to things such as rushes, plants such as rushes, sedges, willows, cottonwood, and common reeds. So again, with all the grasses, it's good to kind of have an idea of where they grow in nature and plant them in somewhat similar conditions for their best performance. So that is the end of the grasses for sun that I'm covering. Of course, there are more, but I covered those that are the most common and that are easily available in nurseries. Are there any questions so far in the presentation?
So it looks like no one has put anything in chat or in the Q&As. So I guess we can continue.
Someone has their hand up, DCWC, whoever that is.
Yeah, and then they took it down.
Oh, okay. All right. Oh, it's up again.
Did you want to put your question in chat, or did you want me to allow you to talk?
There may be a question in the Q&A.
Okay, let me try this. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, thanks. It's Diana. Hey, I have a question about the, if it's not the right time, just let me know, the oat grass. Somebody mentioned that it spreads wildly once you plant it. Does anybody know anything about it?
Yes, in fact, Diana, I'm going to be covering the shade grasses next, and that will be the first one I cover.
Thank you, thank you.
You're welcome.
Then Mimi put a question in the Q&A, and are you gonna cover grasses that do good in slopes?
Well, actually, most of the I've covered so far would do well on slopes and are very good for erosion control. It kind of depends, Mimi, what you're trying to achieve on your slope, you know, whether it's a shady slope or a sunny slope, and what appearance you want, whether you would choose one of the shorter grasses or the taller grasses, and how you would put it in there. And also the conditions, whether there might be salt water splash. If the slope is near the water, the bay, then you may want to choose one that's salt tolerant, like switchgrass, that kind of thing. But all of them have really deep roots and are great for erosion control and slopes, holding slopes. So if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go on to the shade grasses, which there are only 3 that I'm covering right today, because Karen has a lot of sedges to cover too. And if you didn't get to ask your question, we can always come back to it later. So for shade, we're going to cover these 3 grasses. So while most of the native grasses grow in sun, there are a few that grow well in shade, which are really intriguing for me because I live in a shady area. My yard is shady. You'll often find them naturally occurring in woodlands. And the first one we're going to cover is the northern sea oats that Diane asked about. And that has other common names. The common names of plants can be confusing, which is why I've also included the botanical name on each of them. This grass is also known as Indian sea oats, Indian wood oats, and river oats, and northern sea oats. It does prefer a moist site. It will also, though, tolerate dryness. You can use it in naturalized areas like along streams or the edges of water gardens, but you may also see it on rocky slopes and in the woods. It is great for erosion control on stream banks. So it's a nice one for slopes. It does spread rather aggressively. It reseeds easily, and it also spreads with rhizomes. So it spreads in 2 ways. If you want to prevent the spread, if you're planting it in a dry soil, then that is less ideal condition for it, and it somewhat slows its aggressiveness. It is a warm season grass, so it does go dormant in the winter. It is really one of the more shade tolerant grasses. It has lovely seed heads. It's great in floral arrangements. It attracts butterflies. It's the host plant for the pepper and salt skipper butterfly. And it is the North Carolina, or was the North Carolina wildflower of the year. It definitely is salt tolerant. It tolerates sea spray, could be grown on coastal areas. So this is another one if you're on the water, or you are putting some plantings along the bay, this would be a good choice for you, well, depending, it will take both sun and shade, actually. Mostly part shade though. It doesn't like full sun. Let's see. The birds love this plant. They love the stems. and the leaves for nests. It provides cover for animals. And I think that's it. I've probably said a lot about this one. We can move on to our next one, which is bottle brush grass. So I really didn't know a lot about this grass, and I want to grow it. The name, the botanical name Hystrix, actually is Greek for hedgehog, because the bristles or spikelets resemble maybe a hedgehog, or someone thought so. That's really very distinctive, I think, from all the other grasses. It grows naturally in grasslands and dunes, prairies, barren open woodlands. Barrens and open woodlands. It really looks pretty when it's backlit or has raindrops on it. Really lovely flowers. It is native throughout Maryland. However, this is really important, only in soils with good calcium. And generally along the coastal plain, we don't have a lot of calcium in the soil unless you happen to have shell deposits that have enriched the soil with calcium. But it actually can grow very well near concrete because of the calcium in the soil. And it tolerates de-icing salts, and it tolerates compacted soil. So really, this plant is a great plant for urban conditions, urban locations, and along roadsides. It's very salt tolerant, looks great in masses or naturalized. It looks nice with other species as a backdrop. I think we need to use this grass more. It is the host plant for the northern pearly eye butterfly. The bottlebush grass grows in clumps, but it is considered a cool season grass with a good tolerance for shade. So that means it matures earlier than warm season grasses. This grass could actually be grown in containers as long as there's good drainage. And one other very interesting thing about this grass is that the stems and seed heads are coated with a white wax. So that makes it really just an absolutely gorgeous ornamental grass for the garden, especially if it's in front of a dark background. This is a nice alternative for Chinese silvergrass and bamboo. And it does attract butterflies, as I mentioned earlier. And the last shade grass that I'm going to talk about today is wavy hair grass. This grass is really different than pretty much all the others that I think that I've talked about today. It's really rather short. It is evergreen. So if you're looking for an evergreen grass, this is a nice one. It provides nice nesting material for wildlife and food. Could even put it in containers with other plants, or maybe even by itself. Naturally, you're going to find it in nature in the woodland border. It looks nice with perennials. It's a nice kind of complement to them. And there are lots of cultivars that would also be perfect in containers. This grass grows differently. It produces the new growth in the spring, and the best way to remove the old blades is actually to comb your hand or to comb through it with your fingers. You may want to wear gloves, but just pulling the old out that way and cleaning up the old leaves. It grows nicely in clumps, and the seeds are really valuable to birds. This is a good one to stabilize the soil, so it could be used on a slope, especially in a shady, dry spot. So this is one for those more challenging shady, dry spots. And you could use it in place of turf grass, potentially. So next slide, I'm going to briefly talk about the care of grasses. Mainly, really, you would treat them like you would other native plants. Don't fertilize, choose the appropriate location. the big thing to remember about grasses is that we don't need to cut them down in the fall to the ground. We really should leave them until March because there's wildlife overwintering, and then you can trim them up to 2 feet. And you can actually divide grasses, as I've mentioned before, by either seeds or division by cutting the clumps. And if you want more information on that, I can give it to you later in the interest of time. This is actually another picture of the sunrise garden, and it is in the winter. So you can see how valuable grasses are if left up during the winter, how beautiful they can be. And
Melanie, I have one question. Since we're on that side of caring for them. So when should you be thinning out your grasses?
So you mean dividing them?
Yes.
If you're going to divide them, you want to do it in the spring before they've really started growing new growth. And that's for the warm season grasses, which most of them I've discussed are. And then the cool season, you would want to divide in the early fall. But most of the ones I've talked about are warm season.
Okay, and then when should you plant them? Is it similar to that you would want to plant the new grasses if they're warm in the spring, and then if they're the cool ones, you would plant them in the fall?
Generally, although probably if you planted them in either season, they would do okay. They would do fine.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. This next slide is just invasive grasses to avoid. They're all on the invasive species list. I think I'm not going to go into any details about them, but the idea is that hopefully we've given you a lot of alternatives today so that we can begin to get rid of these invasive species and replace them. And that's the end of my part of the talk. And I do feel like I took too much time there.
Okay, well, now we'll turn to sedges. And just, I call this fun facts. If you don't know about the Maryland Biodiversity website, that's a great website that you can go to and see what's native in Maryland. It breaks them down by county. So if you look up a particular plant species, or the Maryland Biodiversity website covers more than just plants, but it's a great resource to find out if something has actually been found in, for example, our county or other counties within Maryland. So according to that website, we have 179 species of sedges in Maryland, which is quite a bit. And I don't think we would realize that. The vast majority of the sedges are wind pollinated, and most of them are going to be found in part shade to full shade. There are some that will tolerate more sun, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a bit here. I found it very interesting that if there's sedges near the water, that their seeds can actually float on the water from days and up to a year. So that's quite a long time that those seeds are viable floating on the water. Wildlife also use those seeds, and so they can be dispersed by ants, by birds, and other mammals. So this is a list of sedges that I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail. The ones that have the asterisks by them, so the blue sedge and the broomsedge, are a couple species that actually do pretty well in more sun, but for the most part, these are ones for part shade or shade. So I feel as a person who has a lot of shade in my yard that sometimes it's challenging to find plants for those areas. But anyway, I'm going to go, like I said, go through some of these in more detail. So the first one up is Pennsylvania sedge. This one is very popular in the nursery trade. It's very easy to find. So if you wanted to plant it in your yard, it'd be pretty easy to find. It is native to Calvert County. It is pretty widespread species. It's found throughout thickets and dry woodlands in eastern and central North America, from all the way from Quebec and Manitoba down south all the way to Mississippi and Georgia. So it's pretty widespread species, but it is, again, native here to Calvert County. Gets about 6 to 8 inches tall. And again, it grows in, shade. It does very well in dry shade. So if you have one of those challenging spots, you might think about using this one. It blooms in spring. You can see in the lower picture the little flower heads. They are, for sedges, the flower heads aren't exactly the most stunning things, but they do add some texture, and most sedges do bloom in the spring. In this particular case, the male and female flowers are on the same stalk. If you were to try to dissect that, you could find the parts of the both female and male parts. This one is really considered sort of evergreen, semi-evergreen. They do form clumps, and it's a great underplanting for shade perennials. This is one of those species that you could use as a lawn alternative. So once you plant it and have it out there, you could just mow it 2 or 3 times a year. You'd want to mow it no lower than 3 to 4 inches tall. So you could kind of use it as a lawn. Although I will say that it doesn't tolerate a lot of heavy foot traffic. So if it's more of a trying to cover bare soil in a shady, dry, shady area to get that ground covered up with plants to help prevent erosion. I have found in the information that it does not grow that well from seed. So if you're interested in planting that, this sedge, it would be best to get them as plugs. And you can find these again in the nursery trade. And you can get 4-inch plugs and they work really well. That's what I did in my yard. This picture on the right-hand side of the screen is actually a picture from my yard where I've planted, I've actually planted 3 different kinds of sedges, but we'll get to that in a minute. All right. Here's another sedge that's also native to Calvert County, white tinged sedge. And you can see the seed heads do have that white to them, and that's where the name came from. There's a close-up of the seed head there. This one gets a little taller than Pennsylvania sedge, up to 8 inches tall, again, part to full shade. This is the one of the sedges that you could use as a lawn alternative, and it does tolerate some foot traffic. So if you're interested in doing that, you might want to think about this particular one. You could intermix some of our shorter perennials, such as lyre-leaf sage or some of the bluets in between to add a little bit of color and add a little bit different texture. With the lyre-leaf sage in my yard, I have that growing. What I do is, in my quote unquote lawn area, I don't really have a lawn, but I do have the lyre-leaf sage in there, and I let the flower stalks flower, let them go to seed a little bit, and then I come along with my lawnmower and cut down those stalks. That's something you could think about. The next sedge, blue sedge, it's got great color, I think. And so, you know, if you're looking for adding a little bit more color to a shade garden, this is one that you might think about using. We don't have any records currently from Calvert County, but I think it's probably native since all the surrounding counties have records. It's just that nobody's uploaded a record into the Maryland Biodiversity website yet from Calvert County. So over on the right-hand side is a picture of the seed head that grows up above the clump. And then once it's done seeding, it'll you know, flop down. But this is, like I said before, this is a great one to add some color texture to a shade garden. It is clump forming. The clumps will get larger over time. You know, it can spread by seed, but and it is one that tends to, I think, spread a little bit more than some of the others, perhaps. The next one is Gray's sedge. So this one is actually named after Asa Gray, who was a botanist back in the 19th century. They had an extraordinary botanical collection, and that was actually the foundation for the Gray Herbarium, which is at Harvard University. It's interesting to note that this sedge is listed as a threatened plant in Massachusetts. But we do have it here in Calvert County. And this one's a really interesting one, I think, to have in your yard based on the star-like flower heads that it develops. You can see over here, there's a close-up on the right-hand side in that picture. And then there's the one on the left-hand side is a picture from my garden. I have a small little pond, and I have this one planted next to the pond. It does prefer moisture soil. So you might find it out in the wild on the edges of swamps and the banks of creeks. If you were to use it in your garden, you could plant it. If you had a pond or a fountain, you could plant it at the edge of that. Or if you had a moister area, it would certainly do well. The other thing, actually, you can actually use it in a container. So something to think about, something a little bit different. You know, get great, again, great texture. The seed heads are great. So you might think about doing that. You can plant it in a little bit drier area because it will tolerate some drier conditions. So for example, you could use it in a rain garden or a bioswale. One note about rain gardens, if you're not familiar with rain gardens, people tend to think, oh, rain garden, that's a place in my yard where the water stands all the time. Well, that's not really what a rain garden is for. A rain garden, when it's developed correctly, does collect water during a rain event, but that water would drain within 24 to 48 hours. So it doesn't really hold the water continuously. So, but anyway, this is one of the sedges that you could use in a rain garden if you had one. Next sedge, another one again, this one's also native to Calvert County. You may not see it as much. I haven't found a source for it to actually purchase, but you actually might find it growing on your property. If you have a shady, woody area on your property, you might actually find it growing. It's got a nice clump to it. It also can grow in part sun, and it prefers a little bit more of your alkaline soil. And it tolerates, it goes from moist to dry, so it's somewhat versatile. This one can spread aggressively in disturbed soil, but if you find it, you could plant it and it wouldn't necessarily spread aggressively, if you're just putting it in your garden along the edge. It is a host plant for the Appalachian brown butterfly. And a number of sedges are host plants for butterflies and moths. For example, back there with the Pennsylvania sedge information I found, that is a host plant for 36 different species of caterpillars. So it could be caterpillars that are either caterpillars for butterflies or for moths. So I think this one's got a pretty interesting seed head, but again, with all sedges, they're not super conspicuous, so you have to get down a little bit to the ground and actually get a good view of the seed heads. The next one, Eastern Star Sedge. Again, another one that's native to Calvert County. It tends to be a little floppy, as you can see over here on the left side in that photo, but the close-up of the seed heads, that's where it gets its name, so they look like little stars. This one, again, blooms April through May, and another one that really prefers the part shade and moister soil. This one also tolerates full shade. So if you have a full shady area that you want to has some more bare soil and you want to get that soil covered up with plants to help prevent erosion, this one might be one that you'd think about. And I have found this one in the nursery trade. As master gardeners, we can't promote particular nurseries, so I can't name the nursery where I found it, but if you look online, you can certainly find it for yourself. This one gets a little taller in terms of the seed head and everything. It's up to 2.5 feet tall. Again, it's an evergreen one, so again, this one might be great for a shady location in your yard. Again, good ground cover, and another one that's good to add to rain gardens. And again, as I mentioned before, you can also use it as an edging plant, for paths or for other woodland areas. Another sedge, we don't have plantain leaf sedge. We don't have any records from Calvert County, but it is native to other parts of Maryland. This one, I think, is a great one, as you can tell by its other common names, seersucker sedge. Just the texture of the leaves, that's where it gets that name. So this one's a great one. Again, adding some different texture to your garden. This one gets up to maybe 10 inches tall. Another one that goes in moist shade, but also does well in dry shade. So again, it's a little versatile. So dry shade tends to be a little bit more of an issue for people to try to find plants that grow in there. So this one might be a great ground cover for you to use, again, providing that different texture with those leaves. I think those are kind of unique. So, and again, I have found this one as well in the nursery trade from a couple different nurseries. Another sedge that's also native here in Calvert County, this is Broomsedge, and this one is really found in wetland habitat. And you can see the picture on the right, you know, it's right there in the water. So if you have, you know, a wetland area on your property, you might even find this one growing native, or, you know, if you have an area that you need to plant something to prevent erosion again, you know, keep the soil from going into the water, this one might be something that you would consider. Again, it's found in many different types of wetland habitat, but it is adaptable. So it can grow in different kinds of soil, you know, mud, sand, and gravel, so very adaptable. This is one of the sedges that can also grow in full sun. You know, you can see the picture on the right, it's full sun there. So another adaptable one. This one can get a little taller, you know, with the seeds heads and everything, and it can get up to 40 inches tall. And this is just a list I put together. We've talked about some of these sedges already, but if you're thinking about a sedge that you wanted for the edge of a pond, if you have, you know, maybe a little stream on your property, if you're next to a wetland and you wanted to add additional plants to the edges of it, these are ones that would be good for that. So we've already talked about several of these. The last three listed here, so tussock sedge, eastern star sedge, and the fox sedge, I have also found that those are available in the nursery trade. I do want to mention another sedge. You know, I didn't really talk about any let's see, what am I talking? Different, like either hybrids or things. Sedges tend to be straight species that you find in the nursery trade, although there is one you might see in the nursery trade called Bunny Blue. It's Carex laxicolmus, called Hob or Bunny Blue. This one is an evergreen sedge. I don't have it listed here, but it could also be used as a border or as a ground cover. As the name implies, it's a nice kind of bluish color, and it does have tiny little yellow flowers, but those aren't, you know, particularly ornamental. It does spread, and it makes a nice contrast to other plants that you might have in your shade garden, such as a heucheras or a tiarella. So I just wanted to mention that particular Carex. The species itself is native to Calvert County, but the selection, the blue bunny hob, is a little prettier probably for the garden because they've selected for the color. So I just wanted to mention that one. Now a little bit more about using sedges as lawn. So I've got sedges listed over here on the right side. So we've talked about Pennsylvania sedge, white tinged sedge. I talked about the other three. I didn't specifically talk about those, but I will mention them. You can see the scientific names there. The Catlin sedge or Carex texensis. It isn't native to Maryland, but it is available in the nursery trade. It is a non-invasive, so if you see it, it might be one you could consider if you do want to try to use sedges as a lawn. The Cherokee sedge is native to the southeast U.S., and then there's rosy sedge, which is native to the central and eastern part of North America, so a fairly widespread sedge. But in establishing using sedges as a lawn, it's really best to use plugs because, as I mentioned before, it's harder to grow sedges from seeds. So if you have, depending on how big of an area that you want to plant, you know, you could get a nice flat sedges. The 4-inch plugs work great. I did this in my yard. It's best to start with a weed-free area if you're trying to replace sod that's not doing very well. You probably want to get rid of your sod first. You can do that a number of ways. You can, cover it with black plastic. You can put down cardboard and then put mulch on top of that and leave that for a time period to kill the sod, however well it's doing or not doing, and then remove that and then go, using your plugs and plant. Once they're established, it takes about 2 to 3 years to get them established pretty well. You would just want to mow them only 2 to 3 times a year. And you want to make sure that you don't mow any lower than 3 inches. So I would recommend probably 4 inches. So, so that's something that you can think about in, like I said, in an area that's, not doing very well. Our normal grass, lawn grass doesn't do very well in shade or part shade. Sedges, they don't, once they're established, they don't really take any care. You don't need to fertilize them. As Mealy mentioned with the grasses, you don't want to fertilize them. So very low maintenance plants. You might have a question about, well, do I want to trim the leaves on my sedges? You could at the end, in early spring, if you want to trim them back, that's fine. You don't have to. You can wait for the new growth to just kind of grow over the old growth. But I say very low maintenance.
So this is just a garden design for sun. I'm not going to spend much time on it, especially in the interest of time, but I think we've kind of touched on earlier. This is the Sunrise Garden in North Beach, which the master gardeners helped to provide a plant list for the rain garden. These are pictures of the rain garden and the perimeter of it, and you can see how nicely the grasses complement the other native plants that are listed there.
And then here's something, pictures. This is from my yard. Things to think about if you want to use sedges in your yard. So in the upper left picture, I planted 3 different types of sedges, and I just put these little wood pathways. So my sedges are covering all this area where the previous owner tried to have lawn and it was doing horribly. And so I put in plugs. This is the 2nd year for the plugs. So I planted them last fall for the most part. So you can see they're doing really well. And this sedge here, if you can see my mouse circling it, that's one that I transplanted from a different part of my yard, and I moved it here. It took off. It looks great. If you're thinking about trying to use sedges more as a lawn, or just to cover bare areas that were lawn, some other plants that you can mix in with them include green and gold. And so over here on the right side, this picture again is also from my yard. So I have this green and gold that I planted here. It's slowly working its way in there with the sedges. So that's another plant that you can use. It's another low growing plant. Blooms in the spring. This particular year, my green and gold has bloomed for a couple months now, so it's doing really well. You could also use blue-eyed grasses, native gingers. I mentioned lyre-leaf sage before. You can also put that in there. Bluettes are also another possibility that you can sort of mix in with your sedges and make a nice, very nice area. The other plants obviously are going to give it a little more color, and the sedges are really going to give you the texture. So and then here's some other suggestions that you might use if you're using it as a ground cover in a bed, or using it as an edging or an accent plant. You can include phlox, you can include tiarellas, the heucheras, and then even this small shrub, the fothergilla. So those are just some suggestions in terms of design.
So if you're all set to go out and buy yourself some grasses and sedges, there are a number of actual resources in the trade, as Karen mentioned, but we aren't able to share them. But if you search on the internet, you can find them. However, Chesapeake Natives is a nonprofit that is in Upper Marlboro, and they are a great resource for plants. Atkins Arboretum on the Eastern Shore in Ridgely, Maryland, same thing. And of course, the Calvert County Master Gardener Plant Sale, which is annual every year in May, the weekend before Mother's Day.
And these are just some resources that you could check into. The first book is a recent book. It came out in 2020. If you're really into trying to identify grasses and sedges out in the wild, this is a great new book. It's got a lot of drawings to help you identify grasses. Grasses and sedges are kind of tricky in terms of identification, but this is a great new book. It also has photographs as well, but and some of the other ones here you can look up. They're different books. There's some links here for you to look online. So lots of information there that you can look into later on. And here's some additional links, websites where you can even find more information. There's some information here on how to make a meadow. You can find a lot of information on meadows. And again, great grasses for Maryland landscapes. That's University of Maryland information. So anyway, more resources for you.
And if you want to see some grasses and sedges up close, and then we have some resources right here in Calvert County. The native plant garden, the master gardeners take care of on 30 Duke Street is open to the public. You can go there anytime. That's in Prince Frederick. The Sunrise Garden, I've shown you pictures of that in North Beach. And additionally, actually, we have a few other resources. Annery Garden has some lovely grass and sedge plantings, and Calvert Marine Museum does as well. So we are really fortunate. We have a lot of great examples.
And this is just putting in a plug for our Master Gardener demonstration gardens, which is around the Community Resources building there on Duke Street. So this is just a compilation of different photos we've taken in our garden. It's Baywise certified, and we encourage you all to come out and visit the garden. Right now we are renovating several of the beds because during last year in COVID, we couldn't get out to really do any weeding and care of the garden. So a couple of the beds we're starting over. So you might see some bare areas if you do visit, but there's some pretty lovely areas of the garden. There's down in the lower garden, it's shady. There's a picnic table, there's a bench, there's a little boardwalk there. So we encourage you all to take a visit.
And we thank you. We do apologize. We went over, although we did start a few minutes late, but we respect your time. I did see that one of you had written in the chat that you were taking snapshot pictures, and that's great. But just know that there is a PDF of this that's available for you. Jennifer will tell you more about that. And so you actually, it's great that you took snapshots, but we want to make it more accessible. And that actually was Atkins Arboretum, by the way. Great place to see meadows.
Thank you. This is great. Now we have had several questions. Someone wanted to know if you guys have come across anywhere that you can visit to see an example of sedges being used in lawns.
I have not seen any particular, although the only one that comes to mind is actually in Delaware. So Mount Cuba Center. They actually were doing a trial on sedges. Now I went to their website, and usually they'll post results of their different trials for different species. They've done coneflowers, they've done phloxes, but when we were there, Melanie and I actually visited there a couple of years ago when we attended the International Master Gardener Conference, and they were trialing sedges, and I believe they probably have some areas where they've used that. So if you want to visit that garden, that's actually a very nice garden. It's up in Delaware. They aren't open year round, but they're open now, and this would be a great time to actually visit that garden. So that's one place I can tell you. I am not aware of other places other than, like I said, my own yard, but.
Oh, Tim said he's going to go to the gardens at Duke Street today. Yay. Well, again, they are under revitalization, but still, even still, there are some lovely, lovely plant examples there.
And I think he was asking if there's a shady area, and yes, there is shady areas in the lower, what I say, the lower part of the garden. So I think when you get there, you'll figure it out. So um, somebody else is going there too.
Diana.
But we do have that garden. We do have definitely have different areas. We have an area along the entrance driveway. That's one of the areas we're actually going to rehabilitate. It's a very hot, sunny area, very bad soil. It's got wiregrass in it, so we're redoing that one. We have a sensory garden in there in the front. We've got some slopey areas in the front of the building, and then down in the back of the garden, the lower edge is a more of a wetter area. You'll see the boardwalk. We actually have a Boy Scout that's going to be doing an Eagle Scout project and extending the boardwalk, because we do have a wetter area down there. So the garden does have a lot of sort of little miniature like sites that are different types of gardens. So some are very shady, some very sunny, pollinators. So yeah, it'd be great if you visit that.
Okay, and then one person asked, are sedges green year round? And then if you're using cardboard to kill what is growing and you want to introduce the plugs, how long does the cardboard need to be down or before putting in the plugs?
So the first question about the sedges being evergreen, some tend to be evergreen, but when you're getting into the end of winter and into spring, they might look a little slightly bedraggled because some of the, the leaves and stuff will have little brown tips or whatever, but some of them are definitely, evergreen. They tend to sort of diminish over winter, but they come back really well in the spring. I have, like I said, use Pennsylvania sedge, and I actually used a couple of the other sedges, and that was my experience this year. So they do tend to stay, like I said, evergreen most of the year, not all throughout the winter. And then in terms of the cardboard, I would leave that down probably a couple months. You could even leave it, if you want to leave it over winter and then plant next spring, that's also good too. But you want to try it if you have lawn. You do want to try to kill that off and then, plant your plugs in there. So at least a couple months for sure. And like I said, you can leave it over winter if you want. But I would probably, if you were going to try to do it this year, you'd want to get your cardboard down very soon. And then you might be able to plant this fall because you have a few months before fall planting starts. So, but I just have a little note about buying plants. Melanie and I have had experience looking at ordering plants for our demo garden, and native plants have become very popular. And we've noticed that they sell out of native plants fairly quickly. So if you're interested in buying native plants, think about what you want and get ready to order, definitely toward probably late summer, and then, keep an eye out on, native plant sales. And then I encourage you to order early if you can, because things are selling out.
And I'm not quite sure if you were trying to answer the person who was asking of obtaining the plugs. So how do you research that? Do you just Google the type of grass and then see what plant centers sell them? I think that's mainly just the buying process of finding these sedges or grasses that you want to include in your yard.
I would research, I would probably use the scientific name, the Latin name to search by, and then you're probably going to get results. There are a couple nurseries. I wish I could name them, but and I wish I could name the site where I know you can get them from, but unfortunately we're not supposed to promote commercial places, but there's a couple nurseries that might pop up, and some of them they only sell to not individuals, but there are sources. There's one particular resource online that sources their plants from these other nurseries, and you can find flats of different plants. And you can, the number of plants in the flat can vary. You can get 32 in a flat, and you can get higher numbers in a flat too. But yeah, like I said, I wish I could name the source to help you out, but we you know, we can't do that. You can buy individual sedges, I know, from Chesapeake natives. They do sell what am I trying to say? Sedges, some of our native sedges. Those tend to be not the plugs though. So if you're not doing it in a large area and you're doing it more of an edging, you could start with those smaller size, not plugs, but little larger plants. So Chesapeake natives, and then Atkins Arboretum also sells a lot of sedges as well. So.
It looks like Susan has a question, so I'm going to allow her to talk. Susan, I gave you access to use your mic.
No question.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions before we end this? And I do want to remind everyone that we have 3 more Garden Smarters. We're going to be talking about insects in the garden on June 26th. We'll be talking about beekeeping on September 11th, and Go with the Flow gardening on October 16th. All of these are on the Calvert Library website, and you can go ahead and register for them. And like Karen and Melanie said, I will be sending everybody a link to the recording as well as a copy of the presentation.
So thanks everybody for joining in. We hope you enjoyed it and got some information out of it.
Yes, thank you all very much.